Yo, this is Jara, and this is all the movies I watched this week, and what I thought about them. Enjoy. The Godfather Part I, 1972, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. Now, this is commonly believed to be one of the greatest films of all time, and it really does live up to its expectations. The acting is great, with Marlon Brando standing out in his performance of Vito Corleone, where he creates this duality of a sinister, menacing mob boss, paired with this frail and dying old man. Al Pacino also does really well in portraying the duality and turn of Vito's son Michael, as he moves away from civilian life and follows in the footsteps of his father, pursuing vengeance for those in his family that he has lost. That's also the focus of the narrative. Much of the latter half of the film is centered around Michael's turn from being civilian to becoming ruthless in his reign as head of the Corleone family. Coppola's use of sets and mise-en-scène is also great, with so much care being put into the environments. But the real triumph of the film is its masterful creation of intensity. Dialogue, alongside the acting and the use of close-ups and slow zooms and pans within the cinematography, allowed Coppola to control the tone of the film and the audience reception incredibly well, to the point where the almost 3-hour runtime is barely felt. Throughout the film, there is always this discussion of family, its importance, and also the duality of life and death, as seen with the baptism killing scene, which also in itself comes into some very religious themes of life, death, and retribution. All in all, it's a mastercraft that is as precise, cunning, and calculated as its central characters in Michael and Vito Corleone, with a rich narrative and acting alongside it. And while at some points the film does slow down in the narrative sense, the tension that Coppola creates is retained. 5 out of 5. The Godfather Part II, 1974, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. My expectations going to this were that I was expecting more of the same, but I didn't know quite where the narrative would go. The flashback scenes with Robert De Niro playing Vito are by far the best parts of the film, in my opinion. These sequences gave great insight into Vito's motivations, with how the sheer importance of family was so integral to his life and his decision making. But then on the other side of the film, it's Michael with his moral and human degeneracy, which for the most part I didn't really care for. But it is important as it shows the corruption that comes with power and greed, especially when the person doesn't know how to deal with it. Then, coming with Michael's narrative, is the complication of the plot. There's casinos in Cuba, court hearings, underworld killing after underworld killing, in a way that just spirals out of control, which is linked to the overall plot of Michael's character. But it just feels like there was way too much going on, in a way that didn't add a whole lot to the film. The 20-second intermission on the Blu-ray was sick. It is sad seeing Michael trying to follow in his father's footsteps, trying to hold his family together, but in doing so losing his family, not because they were murdered, but because he pushed them away and even ordered their deaths. Outwardly, the film was about the Corleone family and its fall from grace, but conversely, it's about a man being corrupted, unsure of where his allegiances lie, and in turn pushing away those close to him. The runtime also didn't feel nearly as brief as the first, due to the politics and the lack of intensity that the first had in swathes, which might have been due to the lack of Marlon Brando. Alongside this, the rich and detailed locations of the first film were enhanced upon with the sequels, but ultimately, while Coppola undoubtedly created a masterpiece with the first film, The Godfather Part II simply does not live up to Part I. 4 out of 5. The Killing of a Sacred Deer, 2017, directed by Yorgos Lanthimos. So what became increasingly apparent to me while watching this film, as opposed to his previous film The Lobster, is that this style is exactly what Lanthimos is going for. He's trying to be absurd, making fun of the mundane, satirizing small talk, and the likes. Monotone delivery is a conscious choice, something he apparently advertises on set, and he also makes fun of the savagery of human life. I think the main thing that Lanthimos wants is for the audience to read the performances and narrative in their complete own way. With the lack of emotion that actors give, it makes it easier for the audience to create emotion for the scenes, rather than be subjected to the one present to them. And narratively, I do think the film is pretty cool, although it left a lot of questions. Narratively, I do think the film is pretty cool, although it left a lot of questions. What is essentially a tale of Colin Farrell's character Stephen's repentance for committing a case of malpractice against Martin, Barry Keoghan's father, it turns into a strange story of infidelity, immorality, and human savagery. But at its core, I think Lanthimos just wants to play with the viewer and their expectations. The choice of only saving one child isn't brought up much, and it's dealt with here in quite a humorous way for what it suggests. Not many films that I've watched also have a slow zoom on a woman's apathetic face as she gives a man a handy. And on the other side, has a man practically tossing a coin to find out which child of his he should kill. All in all, I'm not sure what much of the film meant, other than its attempt to subvert convention. Following in line with The Lobster, the movie looks great in its own way. And yeah, Lanthimos' crazy world that he creates within this film, framed through a couple of genres, still feels intimate and real with its own rules, as much as they might go against our own. 4 out of 5. I feel like I didn't talk a whole lot about the movie itself and its narrative, but I feel like with this, it's pretty hard to. Hard 8, 1996, directed by Paul Thomas Anderson. This movie is all about characters and how they can affect the narrative. So it starts endearingly with the relationship between John, played by John C. Reilly, and Sydney, played by Philip Baker Hall, being established. With Sydney coming from a place of knowledge and John coming from a place where he doesn't really know much, it really sets up the father-son dynamic between the two, which is called upon later in the film. And PTA's dialogue often starts with two characters being antagonistic towards each other, and then it's a constant state of warming from there. And this is especially true of this relationship. And this film's particularly dialogue heavy, but because it's so set in the moment, it's more of a world building and character building dialogue rather than expositional and boring. And most of the time it has some real charm and it flows really well. And there's some interesting semiotics here too. For example, John wears Velcro shoes, immediately showing that he's childish and inexperienced, whereas Sydney is in a full suit, showing professionalism and experience. And the cinematography is also pretty cool. PTA has a knack for having a lot of movement and a lot of coverage of characters' emotions via mid or close-ups, and then effectively uses very grounded, somewhat working class atmospheres in the way that they're in a lowbrow casino, they're in cheap housing, they're in a cheap rundown motel in the movie. But yeah, what goes from being realistic goes from being realistic in the sense that this could happen in the absolute worst day in your life. And I feel like that's something pretty cool about this movie. Yeah, what's set up is almost like a casino being swindled movie turns into something very different, with hostage situations involving prostitution and a narrative that becomes way more complex towards the end of the film, and in a good way. But all in all, in his debut, PTA can wield and control tone alongside dialogue better than most filmmakers can, regardless of the number of projects. The solid character-based narrative that PTA wrote is only further textured by its very grounded, not realistic, but subdued aesthetic in the film. This, paired with a strong cast consisting of John C. Reilly, Philip Baker Hall, Gwyneth Paltrow, and Samuel L. Jackson, make this film a good time, with a non-committal runtime, which makes it an effortless watch. 4 out of 5. Under the Skin, 2013, directed by Jonathan Glazer. The very opening scene of this movie, with the shot of the eye, also places perspective, with Johansson's character seeming to be the only one with a brown eye in this whole film. Alongside this, the film kind of bases itself on a flip of the traditional narrative of, primarily we see men being predatory towards women, but in this film it's very much so the other way around. And there's also Darude Sandstorm, but then something cool is removing the background of the scenes when she has successfully seduced the men, helping to show how they've become completely fixated and enamored with Johansson's character. And it's important as it would prevent people from asking, why don't they just leave? Which is a really common thing in horror movies. So on the topic of the human experience, which is what this film is all about, it's weird how disconnected Johansson's character is from it all. She's perfectly good at socializing. In fact, she's really good at it. It's like she understands the human experience on a conceptual level, but not enough to immerse herself in it. And Johansson also does really well in displaying her disconnection from the world and everyone in it, but also bringing a facade of warmth to the performance. There's some really nice shots in this, but overall it's pretty simplistic. But I do think the Scottish landscape helps, as it's such a rural vibe that is underutilized in film. And it really helps because it's the average person's experience as well. Not everyone lives in a city in America. Most people live like this in some random town, physically disconnected from the rest of the world. I think the disfigured man is also an incredibly important moment within the context of the film, because not only does it give weight to the human emotions experienced by Johansson's character, but it does this through showing her someone that has a complete lack of human experience, liking it as much as she does. So in a way, she begins to feel pity and almost sees herself as human. But in turn, it makes it hard to understand the intentions of the characters in the film. Like, why does the motorbike man desire Johansson's killing of men through seduction, and why does Johansson go along with it in the first place? It just makes the film unclear, but the ending's fucked, which is good. And all in all, it's just a really good film about the importance and experience that go into the human experience. There's some cool stuff stylistically, and cool that there's a reversal in the traditional role in the gender roles of sexual violence until the end of the film. And there's really cool aspects of human growth as well. And I guess what this movie is pondering is that, can non-humans truly experience human life and experiences, or are they left to mimic us? 4 out of 5. The Iron Giant, 1999, directed by Brad Bird. Firstly, what the fuck kind of name is Hogarth? Secondly, it was sick. Thirdly, canonical MILFs are sick. So this movie has a cool Americana aesthetic, which hasn't been seen much, which hasn't had much screen time in modern animation. And the blend of 2D and 3D animation is so sick and nostalgic. It's like Osmosis Jones and shit. It's so cool. And narratively, I just thought this was going to be a bland mix of The Big Friendly Giant and DT, but it was so much more. There's so much about identity, autonomy, the American military machine, and just overall warmth to the film, and it's so special. And the Iron Giant itself is also cool because it has just this anachronistic quality to it that's just doubled by the film. It's anachronistic in the sense that it's a big robot in 1950s America, so it just completely could not exist. But it's even cooler because it's the only 3D animated asset in a 2D animation. So it's anachronistic within the world of the film, and it's also anachronistic within the production of the film. So that's pretty cool. And You Are Who You Choose to Be is such an important message for a kid's film. So I felt guilty for wanting to watch Vin Diesel as the Iron Giant go sicko mode. And it was also really sad when he did it, because it wasn't an autonomous action and he had a personal crisis because of it. But it's also sick that he exhibits complex human emotions. And it's crazy that the violent super weapon that has achieved sentience is completely disavowed violence because it is taught killing is wrong. And ultimately his sacrifice of the film is unironically really fucking sad, especially when he says Superman. It's fucked. And in summary, it's a beautiful movie with great animation and the exploration of its themes. It had what should have been a great, beautiful and powerful ending had it ended only 2 minutes before it did, because it just ends with this cop-out ending. And I understand that concessions would have had to have been made as it's a kids movie, but still, it was just, it would have been so much better. You know, the ending was undeserved, but through the sum of its parts, it's still an incredible movie. And this was Brad Bird's debut too, and he already knew how to make a mad MILF. 4.5 out of 5. Thank you for watching the second episode of What I Watched This Week. Like, comment, subscribe. Follow me on Twitter and Letterboxd at Big Vigs. BIGVEEGZ. Thanks.